This is the Dharma talk section and of our evening. And I feel like every time I've given a talk recently, I begin it by saying something like, wow, there's so much uh, divisiveness. There's so much difficulty. There's so much dukkha in the world. And it's true. And it just feels like the current language that I was reading in the paper today was a lot of mostly politicians using the language of, could we turn the temperature down? You know, could we not have things continue to get more and more inflamed with violent violence in language, violence in behavior, violence in activity? Like, can we stop? I hope so. And I want to say that this practice and what we're doing here is a direct balm for that intensity, that heat, that the fire of violence that we see and divisiveness that we see and feel all around us. In the time of the Buddha, there's a beautiful teaching called the Jata Sutta. The word jata means tangle. And as is true in many of the suttas, it's a description of someone who comes to the Buddha and asks a question. And this is someone comes to the Buddha and says, there's a tangle within and a tangle without. In other words, there's a tangle in here and there's a tangle out there. A tangle within and a tangle without. We humans are entangled in a tangle. Gautama, it's the name of the Buddha. Gautama, I ask you, who can untangle this tangle? This is kind of, in some way, ancient, beautiful, poetic language, but it's the same question that we are facing today. Who among us, and I'm not suggesting that there'll be one person who can do it, because it actually takes all of us. But who, or maybe we might say how to untangle this tangle. And I just want to point out, because I think in many ways that the orientation of how it is that, as Amy was saying, that, it's been thousands of years that Buddhism has moved across cultures and countries and through languages and so on. And in what sometimes are referred to as Western convert Buddhism, which is fairly new in the United States at least, that there's a tendency to think of the practice as being largely internal. And clearly, when we come together in an evening like this, we have this wonderful opportunity to be quiet together, to support one another in tuning in to communing with something deep in ourselves, where most of our lives were being pulled out. But I think that it may give us the mistaken idea that Buddhism is somehow all about taking care only of the internal tangles. And as you can hear in the question, it's not just that. That we take care of ourselves, we engage in our own practice so that we can help untangle the external tangles, the tangles without, as well as the tangles within. So here's what the Buddha says. A tangle within, a tangle without. We humans are entangled in a tangle Gautama, I ask you, who can untangle this tangle? And the Buddha replies, one who is established in virtue, discerning, ardent, and astute. Such a one can untangle this tangle. So most of what the Buddha says, discerning, ardent, astute, discerning and astute are both qualities of wisdom, right? They're qualities of clear seeing, which is a lot of what we are cultivating in our mindfulness practice, right? In addition, there's this quality of ardency, which we might think of as kind of wholeheartedness or a quality of dedication. So we're not doing this engagement in a half-hearted way, in a flimsy way. We're really giving ourselves fully to our practice, to being present, to learning how to be with what's here, right? So we're learning to be wise, we're giving ourselves completely, and the first piece that he says is one established in virtue. And over the last set of talks that I've given, including, I think, a week, not last week, but the week before, I've been talking about what's referred to in Buddhist teaching as sila, S-I-L-A, which is often translated as virtue or ethics or morality. And for all kinds of reasons, we tend to not be that excited about this part of the path. I don't know. I think it has a combination of maybe it's the puritanical history of the United States or something, but it has often for many people a feeling of either punitiveness or kind of prissiness, right? And so it doesn't seem like who wants to deal with virtue and ethics and morality when we could be, coursing in wisdom or blissfully hanging out in meditation. However, it does seem to me that especially now, in this time, that it's so important that we turn our attention, that we attend to this quality of what the Buddha is calling virtue, if we are going to succeed in untangling this tangle, the inner tangle and the outer tangle. I was on a phone call this last week with a group of Buddhist teachers who were in a conversation about this tangle, with the kind of open question of how do we respond? What do we do? And perhaps many of you have been asking yourself that question. If you aren't either too afraid or too freaked out to even turn toward it, which is certainly how I feel sometimes. I can't even look. But I had the great good fortune of being on this phone call, and one of the things that was talked about that I found true to my own understanding and experience is that this idea that sati, S-A-T-I, which is the word that we translate as mindfulness, which is the seventh step of the Eightfold Noble Path. And sati is the basis of the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness. It's the basis of the meditative practice that we do in the insight meditation tradition. And the idea was that as fabulous as sati is, at this moment in time, it's not enough. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with sati or that it is that the practice and the cultivation of mindfulness isn't absolutely foundational to everything else that we do, because it is. When we are not practicing mindfulness, we are generally in a state of reactivity. And reactivity is what turns the temperature up. Reactivity is just more tangle, right? But what does that mean for us? And for me, one of the things it means is that we actively and wholeheartedly embrace, the other 7 steps of the Eightfold Path, which was sometimes the Buddha is described as a physician, as a healer for the human condition. And again, I think really important that the Buddha's teachings were never really meant for just saving us as individuals from our own individual suffering. They will do that. They will be helpful in alleviating our individual suffering. But the Buddha always had an eye toward what we might think of as the collective, as the whole, as the culture, because his time and place was also a time where there was a lot of violence. There was ongoing, warring tribes, really, clans, local clans that were going at each other as the whole cultural structure was being reconfigured. And as we know, because of what we're in the midst of ourselves today, it's possible that reconfiguration could offer us something better, could offer us an improvement, Someone was using the term democracy 2.0. I was referring to that. But the process is fraught, right? And we don't know. Are we going to get something, an improved version, or are we going to implode, right? So these other teachings, and particularly this teaching of sati, is so important here, so important now. So again, I don't want to badmouth sati in any way, but I do want to invite all of us to consider what are the other components of the Buddhist path that can help us untangle the tangle, that can help us engage with this incredibly fraught world that we are part of without making things worse. And it does feel like we need to pull out all the stops, right? We need to use all the tools we can find. And I guess another way to say it is that sati isn't the only tool in the Buddhist tool chest, right? So I'm going to elaborate or build on the talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago about this practice of sila, and particularly to dive a little deeper into the practice of what are called the precepts. So sila is the kind of broad term for ethics or virtue, the cultivation of virtue. And the precepts are a subset of that. If you look at the Eightfold Path, the wisdom basket of the path includes wise view and wise intention, which I always think of as a kind of radical reorientation, that we shift from trying to get what we want and get away from what we don't want, which is our habitual reactivity, to living in a way that we are intentionally doing our best to do no harm. This is the practice of ahimsa, which is the kind of overarching theme for Buddhist ethics, for sila, for virtue, for untangling the tangle. So we have this wisdom basket that then informs the next steps of the path, or spokes of the wheel, as it's often described, which are wise speech, wise action, and wise livelihood. And I'm going to speak, kind of focus in on this piece about wise action. Wise action is about our behavior. And the word, there's two teachings that I think are important to contextualize this wise action and the practice of sila and the precepts. And the first is the teaching of karma. And karma, in its simplest form, simply means action. But for many of us, we have adopted the understanding of karma to mean something like fate. You know, it's their karma that such and such happened. And this was really very much what the opposite of what the Buddha's teaching of karma meant. It was very much in part of what karma meant when the Buddha came along. But what he talked about as the law of karma was simply that. So the law of karma doesn't mean you're born into a certain set of circumstances and you're stuck there, which was the way the law of karma had been understood as he came along. What he said was that what the law of karma means is that every action has consequences. Everything you think and say and do has an impact. This is because we are tangled in a tangle. Another way to say that from the positive side is that we're part of this living web. I know last week Eugene talked about independence, interdependence, and dependent origination. And that is this web, which is actually the Buddha's big discovery in his awakening, was what's sometimes called the teaching of pratikkasamuppada. What he discovered was that there weren't individual beings, you know, me's and mine's and I's bumping around. What there was this process, this dynamic flow. So the teaching of pratikkasamuppada means because of this, that arises. Because of that, this comes to be. He's talking about this interdependent web. And when that web is infused with what we describe as greed, hatred, and delusion, what do we get? A tangle. So in its positive way, we're part of this living web of being. But when that living web of being is tangled, it becomes, we might say, a living hell. It becomes what we see all around us, the negative side of what we see all around us. But we can also come to understand that that web is actually how we get out of the tangle. By recognizing that, you know, it's like that image of a stone in a pond, that everything we say and think and do, it ripples. It has an impact. This doesn't mean you're in control, because karma is complex. And it doesn't mean you're to blame. It's really important. But it does mean that you can be intentional and that you are responsible. You're responsible for your own actions. And responsible, again, I have to tease apart. Responsible doesn't mean blame, which is where most of us go. Responsible means we're all doing the best we can. And when we tune in to this teaching of sila, of ethics, of really paying attention to our karmic actions, our behavior, then we can put ourselves into a loop where we're really paying attention to the whole, what I call, arc of karma. So if karma means action, there's the intention that precedes the action, there's the action, and then there's the impact. And if we start to pay close attention to that arc of karma, then we have an opportunity not to be perfect, but to learn, to start to notice when we say something and we were really well intended and it doesn't go very well. That's important for us to learn, not to beat ourselves up, but to learn from, right? And the opposite may be true. We may do something and think, ooh, that really wasn't so wise. And we may get feedback from other people that it was actually really helpful, right? So this process of staying, I think of as staying awake, right? Through the whole arc of karma is part and parcel of what's needed now. That there's a need to focus on virtue, on the goodness of our behavior, not because we're going to get it right all the time. We actually pretty much, I can promise you, we won't. But that we make a commitment to do the best we can and to stay awake so that we can learn from what we do. We can learn from the mistakes that we will inevitably make so that we can keep untangling together, right? Each of us and all of us, because you can hear the way I'm describing this, you can't do this just by yourself, right? This sila, the behavioral part of the Eightfold Path, it's about relationship. It's about how do we live well together. And part of how that works is that we need each other. I don't get to just decide from my side how things are going. I actually have to check in with other people to find out. That's good news because it allows us to be sensitive, right? Sensitive and to know that what we think and say and do has an impact and to be willing to tune in and find out, how's it going, you know? So the precepts are a subset of this category called wise action, which is the fourth step on the Eightfold Noble Path. And I talked last week about the sort of single overarching precept is the precept called do no harm. And that precept, it's interesting, I looked up the word precept. I have to look at it because it was new for me. Pre means before, and the Latin for sept is capere, which means to take or grasp. So taking up precepts means that we're starting to pay attention before we take or grasp, which is a way of saying we are pausing before we engage in our habitual reactive behavior, right? Which is, in Buddhist basic psychology, grasping after what we want and pushing away what we don't want. That's the cycle of reactivity that tightens the tangle. If we're going to untangle the tangle, we want to take up these precepts. We want to, in a very intentional way, begin to pay attention to our behavior in these particular ways that are laid out. So in the very early part of the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddha gave the monks and nuns a fairly elaborate set of rules and regulations that were called the patimoksha. And there were hundreds of rules for the monks. There were even more for the nuns, and they ranged in everything from, don't kill to how to arrange your robes, and what kind of bed to sleep on and how to eat, you know? So it was a really wide set of do's and don'ts for the monastic community. For the lay community, what we have were these precepts, which are much less about rules than they are about guidelines that help us pay attention to our behavior. So again, the overarching guideline is called do no harm. And then that overarching guideline is played out in these 5 flavors, which are the 5 basic precepts that have been handed down over thousands of years. And those 5 flavors are of not doing harm are don't kill, don't steal, don't misuse sexuality, don't lie, and don't intoxicate. And each of those precepts, those guidelines, were offered in a way to help us untangle the tangle, to help us prevent ourselves from getting tangled up in harmful behavior, right? And last week I talked about, and I want to say a little bit more about there are 3 different levels or ways that we can understand these precepts. So the first is at a very strict kind of do not. So if the precept says, I'm going to use the first precept as a way to sort of talk through this. If the precept says do not kill, don't kill. Don't eat meat, don't step on bugs, don't wear leather shoes, you know, like it's a very strict understanding of do not. The second layer of the precept is a precept in which we open it up and look at, even if I, as an individual, am very strict in maintaining the precept of do not kill, there are still both conundrums here to be explored, like never. What about if you kill someone who's killing others? Is that ever okay? What about euthanasia? What about abortion? Are these strict no-nevers? Or can we enter into a conversation in which we are grappling with, in which we're wondering about, in which we're not so sure? This level of the precept I think about as the level of engaging the precepts through compassionate inquiry. This is the level where even if I as an individual am doing everything I can, I have to recognize and acknowledge that I'm part of systems that kill. So there's a shift from I as an individual to recognizing this truth of interconnectedness, and then seeing how much more complex things get within that context. So this is a place, I think, where we can give ourselves over to exploring the precept rather than just, strictly adhering to it. And what I said during the last talk, which I think is, for me, a useful way to engage it, is that when I'm in a state where I'm super triggered, everybody understand what that means, when you're like not at your best, you are upset about something, you're overtired, often we know when we're in not in our best mind, not in our best heart. That's a place to default to do not. So whatever it is that I'm thinking I need to do right now, that's the place where it's often really helpful to just say, no, I'm not going to send the email. I'm not going to yell at that person. I'm not going to like that, right? When I'm in a more reasonable state of heart and mind, then I can engage the precept at the second level. I can really be willing to take a look as I move through the day at how am I doing? Not only am I killing bugs, but am I killing by cutting off my own thoughts or wishes, or am I doing that to other people? So it's really broadening and widening the understanding of what the precept means and exploring it from that place. And then finally, the third layer or level of the precept is what's sometimes called the Buddha's mind. This is the precept as if we're looking through the eyes of a Buddha, and how does the Buddha see it? So I'm going to read you there are different translations of this precept that reflect these different layers. So in the original, we have this great old Zen teacher, Maizumi Roshi, and he described the precept of not killing as do not kill. That's level one, right? Just don't do it. And then we have at this kind of broader systemic level, there's a beautiful articulation of the precept that comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, who says it this way. He describes the precept more in the positive. So instead of do not, he describes it as the precept that is reverence for life, right? So the flip side of do not is the do. So do have reverence for life. And he says it this way: aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life. Sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. He says, aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, I vow to cultivate compassion and learn ways to protect lives of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I am determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to condone any killing in the world, my thinking or my way of life. So you can feel how it's a much broader understanding of the precept. And his articulation is echoed by another version from Catriona Reed from Manzanita Village, which is one of my favorites. And Catriona Reed describes the precept this way: aware of the violence in the world and of the power of nonviolent resistance, I stand in the presence of the ancestors, the earth, and future generations, and vow to cultivate the compassion that seeks to protect every living being. So you can feel how this is a very different quality of the precept. It's not just don't. It's much broader than that. It invites the reverence for life. It invites the care that we bring to protecting human life, animal life, plant life, mineral life, like that. Beautiful ways of speaking to it. And I'm going to read one more version of the precept that comes from Bernie Glassman, who was a Zen teacher who founded what's called the Zen Peacemaker Order. He was renowned for doing these, what he called street retreats. So instead of having people do retreats in a lovely retreat center somewhere, he would have his students go out onto the streets of New York City and do retreat that were a form of taking up voluntary homelessness for a period of time. And his articulation of the precept is really, for me, a description of this sort of vision of the precept through the Buddha's eyes, the Buddha mind level of the precept. He says, recognizing that I am not separate from all that is, recognizing that I am not separate from all that is. This is the precept of non-killing. So when we understand this truth of our deep connectedness, when we understand that we're part of this living web, then we're less likely to kill. Then we're less likely to cause the web to get tangled, right? Because we understand that it is our shared home, right? So he really cuts to the essence of the precept. Yeah. So the last thing that I want to say is that the Buddha gave this beautiful instruction to his son, Rahula, which gives us a window into understanding how we might engage with these precepts. And it really reminded me a lot of this phone call that I was on this week with the teachers who were saying, how can we include more aspects of our practice beyond just the practice of mindfulness? And in this sutta, the Buddha is talking to his son, and he says, Rahula, what is a mirror for? And Rahula says, it is for reflection. And the Buddha goes on to give him this instruction for reflecting throughout the day as a way of staying awake. And I'll read you just a little bit of it so you can hear its beautiful language. The Buddha says to Rahula, in the same way, Rahula, all of your actions of body, speech, and mind should be done with repeated reflection. Before you do or say something, you should reflect. Will this action be skillful or unskillful? Will it lead to difficulty or suffering for myself or others? Or will it lead to painful consequences or painful results? And if on reflection, you know that it will be unskillful, that it will lead to difficulty for myself or others, or that it will cause painful consequences or painful results, then you should not do it. So he's not telling Rahula what to do. He's not saying you should do this and you shouldn't do that. He's giving him instruction for how to reflect so that he can make the decision. And this is the same instruction we give for ourselves, that we too can pause as we move through the day and reflect. Is this email I'm about to send? Is this thing I'm about to say? Is it going to be skillful or unskillful, harmful or not harmful? And if it's going to be harmful, then we don't do it. But, he says, if on reflection, you know that it would not be unskillful, that it would not lead to difficulty or suffering, but that it will cause positive consequences and positive results, then you should do it. So it's not all restriction. It's not all no. The key, and the key I would say to working with these precepts also, is not just about do not. It's about helping us wake up. And in the sutta, the Buddha goes through and says the same instruction to Rahula, you should do this before, during, and after. I think during is really hard, because then we're in sort of the heat of the moment, right? But we can begin to practice before we do something to pause and consider, is this going to be harmful or unharmful, skillful or unskillful? And then we do our best. And then we notice again after, was this thing that I said or did skillful or unskillful, harmful or unharmful? And he gives this instruction. If after you have said or done something and you do the reflection, if it was harmful, then he says you should speak about it, reveal it, Share it with someone you know and trust. In other words, he's not suggesting we're not going to make mistakes. He's just suggesting that when you make a mistake, you can share that with someone and go, "Ooh, I made a mistake," so that you can correct yourself, so that you can do better next time. And he says, if it was skillful, if it was helpful, then you should rejoice and be happy. So what he's saying here and what he's inviting us into, which I am proposing that we can do in the context of these precepts, is to pay attention as we go through the day. Am I doing something? Am I about to do something that has the quality of killing, of squashing, of harming? Am I doing something that has the quality of killing, of squashing, of harming? And when we're done, we can reflect back on our day, on our actions, and say, was there any time today that I did something that was harmful, that was in that spirit of killing something? And if we did, then we can share it with someone. We can talk about it so that we can do our best to not repeat it again, so that we can learn from it. And if we did things that were not, if we did the flip side, if we did things that were sharing our reverence for life, that were supportive of life, then we should rejoice and be happy. So for each of us, this is kind of an applied way of engaging with sati. That it's not something that we just do singularly, quietly on our cushion, but that we can, and I would say our world desperately needs all of us to be paying attention, to reflect in the way that the Buddha is suggesting to Rahula as we go through the day. Not so that we get it right, not so that we're perfect, but so that we can be in an ongoing process of learning, of growing, of self-correcting. This is one of the ways that we can use virtue to help untangle this tangle. We can begin to pay attention to our behavior in a way that will help untangle both the inner tangle and the outer tangle, the tangle within us, but also the potential harm that gets done, the broader tangle that we are all engaged in or part of in this web that we share. So I will close there and thank you for your kind attention this evening, and also for whatever pieces of this you pull through into your life and your work and your families and your relationships. Because our world needs us to wholeheartedly engage in untangling this tangle. So may any goodness, any benefit, any merit that may have come from our practice together this evening be freely, fully, and generously shared for the benefit of all beings everywhere. By the power and truth of our practice together, may we, together with all beings, be free from suffering. And may all of us learn to untangle this tangle so that we can awaken and be free. Thank you all very much. please take good care of yourselves in these difficult days.